And that would, to your point, be perhaps a detriment to the Democrats here. Shira, let me bring you back in to add to a little bit of what Jonathan said. There's that new poll that shows most Americans aren't even paying attention this time around. A lot of people were engaged in the fiscal cliff, maybe because of the name, as opposed to something called a sequester, and we all think of jury. But the bottom line is very few people say that they've paid a lot of attention to what's going on here. How does that play, at least in negotiations, if at all?
Well, I think there's less of a kind of a crisis mentality. If anything, voters kind of have crisis fatigue at this point. It's debt ceiling versus fiscal cliff, now the sequester, and especially as Jonathan pointed out, that the sequester cuts are kind of a rolling cut. They don't really get this. But I will say the White House is probably in a better position messaging-wise, because what they can do right now and what they are doing right now is pointing to the individual cuts. Right. And that really resonates with voters and people who are monitoring the news, being able to say, oh, meat packers won't be able to inspect meat as frequently, or you're going to see longer lines at the airport. That really resonates with people. So that's effective messaging on their part. And Republicans do not have that same luxury right now.
So does it, though, resonate only, though, with the people who agree with the president? I mean, you talk about, for example, it's not likely that these Republicans in the reddest part of our country are receiving calls from their constituents. So is this, again, another situation where it resonates if that's what you believe, but we still go back to the very core of this huge ideological gap in this country and in our people who are elected to represent us on what should be done, particularly when it comes to tax revenue, Shira?
Well, I think the people who agree with the president will probably back up his message on this. But let's remember the president's approval rating, I believe you said earlier, was 51%.
55
so most of the
in one,
country,
55 in another, yeah.
55. Yes, exactly. So his approval rating is high. Most of the country still agrees with him along those lines. The problem is the way a lot of these House districts are drawn. Republicans hold the House majority, and that is not necessarily representative of the American public as a whole.
Governor Rendell, what's the end game? What's this next big move here, you think?
Well, first of all, I want to say, when people start getting laid off, and that's going to happen sooner than later, their neighbors and everyone involved is going to be pretty pissed off about this. So I think it's not quite as a rolling effect as Jonathan says, number one. But number two, look, the end game is we ought to be doing the grand bargain. As co-chairman of the campaign to fix the debt, we are kicking the can down the road. And we keep kicking the can down the road, and the debt mounts at $3 billion a day. We need to get serious at some time, whether it's with the continuing resolution, whether it's the next debt ceiling. Before then, we've got to do something that really will take care of debt, not only in the next 10 years, but in the 10 years after that and the 10 years after that. We've got to get debt under 70% of our GDP, or else we're going to be facing a real economic crisis. So it's time for us to get serious. Maybe kick the can down the road one more time, but after that, we better be serious.
Wow. Well, I totally agree with Ed on that, and I also agree with you on the way for the Democrats to convince the American public of the seriousness of this is to go to the specifics when the layoffs start taking place, especially in red or swing congressional districts. So I assume that the White House is planning, they're not just going to go to big cities when these cuts start hitting. They're going to go right into John Boehner's district, places where these cuts are hitting, to see if they can light a fire under the Republican members of Congress.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Governor Rendell. Thank you, Shira. Great pleasure having you on with these developments. Also, a major